The only people that I know who aren't are people who are unhappy in life and then a big disappointment to them.
There are actors who play a role, and there are actors who become one. Dan Blocker belonged to the second category. For 14 years, he was Hoss Cartwright, the gentle giant of the Ponderosa. A man so large he seemed built out of the same rock as the mountains behind him, yet so soft-hearted that an entire generation of children grew up believing that being big and being kind were the same thing. Then, in the spring of 1972, at the peak of everything he had built, he was gone. 54 years later, in the spring of 2026, the woman who had loved him longest and said the least about it followed him, closing a story that had quietly stretched across 3/4 of a century. This is that story, told the way it actually happened. Bobby Dan Davis Blocker was born on December 10, 1928, in the small town of DeKalb, Texas, in the northeastern corner of the state near the Arkansas and Oklahoma borders. He arrived enormous, a fact that would follow him his entire life, and it did not take long for the world to notice. His parents, Ora Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker, were farming people, the kind who measured a year by what the land gave back rather than what a paycheck said. Less than a year after Dan was born, the Great Depression tore through rural Texas like a wildfire, and it took the Blocker farm with it. Ora did what a lot of ruined farmers did in that decade. He found another way to feed his family. He moved them to O'Donnell, a dusty crossroads town just south of Lubbock, and opened a small grocery store. The Blockers lived in rooms behind the shop, and young Dan grew up in the smell of flour sacks and the sound of a bell over a door. He was already outsized for his age, and the story goes that his father used to joke that the boy broke more merchandise than he sold. Dan himself, years later, would repeat something his father liked to say about him, that he was too big to ride and too small to hitch a wagon to, no good for a single practical thing. It was the kind of joke a father tells a son he loves, and Dan carried it with him like a badge rather than a wound. O'Donnell was tiny, a few hundred people scattered across flat ranch country, and there wasn't much to do on a Saturday night except make your own entertainment. By his teenage years, Dan Blocker was already known around town as a boy built like a grown man, and word of his size and strength spread the way it does in small towns. He went on to attend the Texas Military Institute and later began his college studies, eventually playing football at the collegiate level, before his path bent sharply away from the gridiron and toward the stage. What changed everything was theater. A production needed someone strong enough to handle heavy props, and Dan, always the biggest person in any room, was the obvious choice. Somewhere between hauling furniture and standing in the wings, he got pulled into a small role, and the feeling of being watched by an audience, of making people laugh or lean forward, did something to him that football never had. He was hooked before he understood what had hooked him. Life did not let him chase that feeling right away. In the early 1950s, with the Korean War grinding on, Dan Blocker was called into the United States Army. He trained stateside before shipping out, and he served in Korea as the conflict entered its brutal, grinding final years, the kind of war fought over the same hills again and again. He returned home with the rank of sergeant and, according to family accounts published decades later, a Purple Heart for wounds suffered in combat. He did not talk about it much in public life. Like a great many men of his generation, he treated his service as something that had happened to him rather than something he wanted credit for, and it shaped him in ways that showed up later in small, telling details, such as his lifelong discomfort with firearms despite spending his most famous years wearing a gun belt on television every week. It was around this period of his life, while he was a student at Sul Ross State Teachers College in Alpine, Texas, that he met a young woman named Dolphia Parker. She had grown up on a ranch in Texas, one of 6 children, the kind of upbringing that produces people who do not rattle easily. They fell for each other the way college sweethearts do, and when Dan came home from Korea, they married in September of 1952. It was the beginning of a partnership that would carry both of them through fame, loss, and eventually decades of quiet life neither one of them could have predicted while they were young and broke and starting out. Marriage came with responsibility, and Dan Blocker answered it the way he answered most things, directly. He went back to school, eventually earning an advanced degree in dramatic arts, but acting was not yet a living. He took work as a schoolteacher, first in Texas and later in New Mexico, teaching English and drama to teenagers who had no idea their teacher would one day be a household name. Meanwhile, his family was growing. He and Dolphia welcomed twin girls, Dana and Debbie, in 1953, followed by a son, David, in 1955, and later a second son, Dirk, after the family had relocated to California. By the time all 4 children had arrived, Dan Blocker was a father of 4 working a teacher's salary, a long way from Hollywood in every sense that mattered. The move west, in late 1956 or early 1957, was not a leap of blind faith so much as a calculated risk taken by a man who had already proven he could work hard for very little reward. Dan enrolled to continue his graduate studies while picking up small parts in television, the way countless actors before and since have tried to break in. One line here, one scene there, background work that occasionally turned into something more. The mid to late 1950s were a golden age for the television western, and a man of Dan Blocker's size and presence was, in a strange way, perfectly suited to the moment. Studios needed big men who could hold their own in a saloon brawl or fill a doorway menacingly, and Blocker began landing guest spots on shows like Gunsmoke, Have Gun, Will Travel, Maverick, and The Rifleman. He also took a small, early credited role in a Three Stooges short and appeared in episodes of other anthology and Western programs, slowly building the kind of resume that casting directors notice, even when audiences don't yet know the name attached to it. He also had a short-lived starring role on a series called Cimarron City, playing a character built, fittingly, around his imposing size. The show did not last, canceled after a single season, and for most actors that kind of failure stings for years. For Dan Blocker, it turned out to be the door closing on one room so that another, much bigger one, could open. In 1959, producer David Dortort cast Dan Blocker as Eric Hoss Cartwright in a new NBC Western called Bonanza, the story of a widowed rancher and his 3 sons of different mothers, working a vast spread of Nevada land called the Ponderosa. Blocker was the middle son, the biggest of the 3 brothers, and the show's creative team leaned into exactly the contrast that made him so effective, a mountain of a man who was, underneath it all, the gentlest member of the family. Bonanza did not conquer television overnight. In its first season, ratings were weak enough that network executives seriously discussed canceling it, partly because it aired in a Saturday night slot opposite the far more established Perry Mason, and partly because producing it in color, still a novelty, and an expense in the early 1960s, cost far more per episode than black and white programming of the era. But NBC believed in the show's potential, in part because color broadcasting was central to the network's future, and they moved Bonanza to Sunday nights. The results were dramatic. Audiences found it, sponsors came aboard, and Bonanza grew into one of the most successful and enduring programs in the history of American television, eventually running for 14 seasons and airing well over 400 episodes. Dan Blocker played Hoss for the entirety of the show's run, and the role suited him so precisely that many viewers assumed the character and the actor were essentially the same person. The truth was more layered. In real life, Blocker was educated, well-read, active in progressive political causes such as civil rights and peace advocacy, and known among cast and crew for a sharp, sometimes quick temper balanced by an equally quick willingness to apologize. He said in interviews that he shaped Hoss's gentleness around a quotation attributed to the 18th century Quaker missionary Stephen Grellet, something to the effect that we pass this way only once, so any kindness we can do, we should do now. That idea became the emotional backbone of the character, and it clearly meant something to the man delivering the lines, not just the character he was playing. By the mid-1960s, Bonanza had made Dan Blocker one of the most recognizable men in America, and fame arrived with all the complications that come standard with it. He and Dolphia made a deliberate choice not to live the way many of their Hollywood peers did. Rather than a mansion in Beverly Hills, they settled into a modest home in the San Fernando Valley, not far from a studio, practical rather than showy. Blocker never seemed entirely comfortable with the attention his fame generated, particularly the physical closeness strangers assumed they were entitled to, people grabbing his arm in public, hugging him without asking, treating a family outing for ice cream as an open invitation to gather around. He handled it with more patience than most people would have managed. At home, by all accounts, He remained the same playful, occasionally hot-tempered but big-hearted man his children knew before any of them understood what famous meant. He was also, in 1963, one of the founding partners behind the Bonanza steakhouse restaurant chain, an early and successful example of an actor turning his television fame into a real business. And the chain eventually grew to hundreds of locations across the country. Family, faith, and a handful of political and social causes he believed in mattered more to him than the trappings of celebrity. And those closest to him said that never changed no matter how large his fame grew. In the spring of 1972, with Bonanza entering what would become its final season, Dan Blocker went in for a gallbladder surgery, a cholecystectomy, one of the most common and generally low-risk surgical procedures performed in American hospitals. There was every reason to expect a full and uneventful recovery. The operation itself, at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood, California, went forward without apparent complication, and Blocker returned home to rest and recuperate, expecting to be back on set before long. Then, within days, something went badly wrong. He woke at home complaining of shortness of breath and severe distress. He was rushed back to the hospital, but it was too late to reverse what was happening inside him. A blood clot, likely formed during his period of post-surgical recovery, had traveled to his lungs and caused a pulmonary embolism, a sudden and often fatal blockage of blood flow through the pulmonary artery. On May 13, 1972, Dan Blocker died. He was 43 years old. The shock across the country was immediate and profound. Here was a man whose entire public identity was built around size, strength, and permanence, gone within days of what should have been a routine medical procedure. Bonanza's production team and cast, many of whom had spent nearly a decade and a half working alongside him 5 and 6 days a week, were devastated. Michael Landon and Lorne Greene, his closest friends on the show, lost not just a colleague, but by every account, something closer to a brother. In an unusual move for the era, the writers of Bonanza chose to acknowledge Hoss Cartwright's death within the storyline that autumn rather than simply writing the character out or recasting the role, a quiet tribute to how irreplaceable Blocker had become to the show and to its audience. Bonanza limped through one final, shortened season without him before ending its remarkable run in January of 1973. Dan Blocker was buried in a family plot at Woodman Cemetery in DeKalb, Texas, the small town where his story had begun 43 years earlier. Dolphia Blocker was 39 years old when her husband died, left to raise 4 children who ranged in age from teenagers down to a child barely out of grade school. She did not do what a great many people in her position might have done. She did not write a memoir. She did not appear on talk shows to discuss her grief or trade on her husband's memory for public attention. Instead, she did the harder, quieter thing. She held her family together through the turbulence of their teenage years, kept them close to the values she and Dan had shared, including a lifelong commitment to causes like civil rights and social justice, and largely stepped out of public view. Once her children were grown, Dolphia moved to Santa Barbara, California, a place she came to consider home for nearly the next 4 decades of her life. She never remarried. She spent those years traveling, writing poetry, supporting causes she believed in, hosting holidays, and keeping her grandchildren for long stretches at a time. Those who knew her in Santa Barbara described a woman with an almost magnetic warmth, someone whose home was reliably full of food, wine, laughter, and people who wanted to be near her. Her children, several of whom eventually settled in or near Santa Barbara themselves, stayed remarkably close to her, drawn, as her family later put it, by a presence in her that was hard to put into words but impossible to miss. For more than 5 decades, Dolphia Blocker lived the quiet, private life she and her husband had always preferred, largely out of the public eye except for the occasional retrospective piece about Bonanza or her late husband's career. That changed only recently. On April 19, 2026, Dolphia Blocker died of a stroke in a hospital near her longtime home in Santa Barbara. She was 93 years old. Her elder son, David Blocker, a film producer, confirmed her death publicly, and in the days that followed, tributes poured in from fans who had grown up watching her husband on television and who, in many cases, had no idea until that moment that Hoss Cartwright's widow had lived such a long, full, and deliberately private life in the decades since his death. Her family's remembrance of her focused not on the tragedy of losing Dan so young, but on the life she built afterward. Nearly 40 years in Santa Barbara, 5 siblings she had grown up with on a Texas ranch, a devotion to tolerance, patience, and love for the people around her, and a household that stayed open to family long after the cameras that once surrounded her husband had moved on to other stories. She was, in the words used by those closest to her, the heart and soul of the Blocker family long after the world had stopped paying attention. It is tempting, looking back, to treat Dan Blocker's death as the entire tragedy, a life cut off exactly when it seemed most secure. But the fuller story, the one that only makes sense now that both halves of it have played out, says something different. Dan Blocker built, in a short and improbable life, a reputation for genuine kindness that outlasted every ounce of his fame. Dolphia Parker, given decades longer than her husband ever got, spent that extra time quietly proving the same thing was true of her, that the softest, most enduring kind of strength rarely announces itself, and that a life spent avoiding the spotlight can still leave behind more warmth than one spent chasing it. Hoss Cartwright was, in the end, only a role. But the man who played him and the woman who loved him spent their real lives building something sturdier than any character ever could be. A family that stayed close, a set of values that did not bend with fame or fortune, and a legacy that more than half a century later still moves people who never met either one of them. That, more than the sadness of how it ended, is the part of the story worth remembering.